The operating theater at the NATO Role 3 hospital in Kandahar was Commander Julian Thorne's sanctuary in his kingdom. It was a world of sterile steel, brilliant light, and the rhythmic, life-or-death beeping of monitors. Here, Thorne was an artist, a virtuoso of trauma surgery whose speed and skill were legendary. He moved with an arrogant, balletic grace, his commands to his team sharp, precise, and intolerant of the slightest hesitation. He was a man who thrived in the storm, who saw the mangled bodies of soldiers not as tragedies, but as complex, high-stakes puzzles he was uniquely qualified to solve. His ego was as sharp as his scalpel, and he had little patience for those who could not keep pace with the furious rhythm of his work. This included, most recently, the quiet army nurse who had been assigned to his team as a liaison. Major Anya Sharma was an anomaly. She was an officer, yet she worked the floor with the quiet diligence of a junior enlisted medic. She was methodical, observant, and her composure was a placid lake in the middle of his carefully orchestrated hurricane. He found her stillness unnerving, her quiet, occasional suggestions an irritating distraction. He was a Navy surgeon, trained in the fast, aggressive world of fleet medicine. Her calm, deliberate army pace felt sluggish, academic. He dismissed her as a bureaucrat in scrubs, a career officer more concerned with checklists than with the brutal, split-second realities of saving a life on the table. The tension between Thorne's explosive energy and Anya's quiet competence was a low, simmering undercurrent in the daily life of the hospital. He would call for an instrument, and she would have it in his hand before he finished the sentence, her anticipation flawless. Yet, he would never acknowledge it. She would notice a subtle change in a patient's vitals on a secondary monitor and quietly point out, only for him to ignore her until the primary alarm confirmed her observation moments later, a delay that could cost precious seconds. He saw her competence not as a sign of skill, but as a lucky guess, a random data point. He had built his reputation on being the smartest, fastest man in any room, and he was not prepared to entertain the notion that this unassuming army major might be operating on his level, let alone a level above. Anya, for her part, endured his condescension with a quiet, unreadable patience. She performed her duties with a meticulous perfection that was its own form of defiance. She did not need his approval. She was there for the soldiers, a silent, steady presence dedicated to the singular mission of sending them home alive. Her history, her rank, her true purpose on this temporary assignment were all secrets she kept locked behind a mask of quiet professionalism, waiting for a crisis that would inevitably demand their revelation. The crisis arrived with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, piercing maskal siren that shattered the midday lull. A joint U.S. and British Special Forces convoy had been hit by a complex ambush, a daisy chain of IEDs followed by a disciplined, overwhelming firefight. The radio chatter painted a grim, chaotic picture. Multiple helicopters were inbound, carrying a wave of critically wounded operators. The hospital, already strained, was about to be pushed to its breaking point. The controlled environment of the surgical wing exploded into a frenzy of preparation. Thorne was in his element, a commander mobilizing his army, his voice a series of sharp, decisive commands that cut through the rising tension. He assigned teams, prepped the operating rooms, and turned the entire ward into a finely tuned machine designed to process and repair the human wreckage of war. Anya moved through the preparations with her usual, unnerving calm. She coordinated with the blood bank, ensured the crash carts were fully stocked, and laid out the specialized equipment needed for complex vascular and neurological trauma. She was a silent, efficient force, a master of logistics and preparation. But Thorne, in the heat of the moment, saw only a nurse performing her duties. The storm was coming, and he was convinced he was the only one capable of steering them through it. The first wave of casualties was a deluge of blood and pain. The trauma bay became a controlled nightmare, a production line of life-saving interventions. The air was thick with the sounds of monitors, the shouts of medics, and the quiet, desperate prayers of the wounded. Thorne was a blur of motion, moving between patients, his brilliant mind assessing, prioritizing and acting with a speed that was both awesome and terrifying. He was a god of trauma, reshaping fate with his bare hands and the cold, hard steel of his instruments. Anya was assigned to his primary operating theater, the nexus of the entire maskal response. She was a silent, indispensable part of his machine, her hands always ready, her eyes always scanning the monitors, her presence a steady, quiet counterpoint to his explosive energy. He barely looked at her, communicating in a series of grunts and one-word commands, seeing her as little more than an extension of his own will. They worked through a series of devastating injuries, a brutal parade of the many ways the human body can be torn apart. And through it all, Thorn felt the familiar, arrogant thrill of mastery, the godlike satisfaction of imposing his will upon the chaos of death. They saved two, lost one, and then the doors burst open again. The new patient was a Green Beret Master Sergeant, a giant of man whose body had been savaged by shrapnel. He was unconscious, his breathing ragged, and a river of blood was pouring from a massive wound to his chest. His vitals were crashing. He was in the stark, unforgiving language of the trauma bay, circling the drain. Thorn and his team descended on him, their efforts a frantic, desperate race against time. He's bleeding into his chest cavity, but I can't find the source. Thorn yelled, his voice tight with frustration. It's not the aorta, it's not the pulmonary artery. Where the hell is it coming from? They pumped blood into him as fast as they could, but it was like pouring water into a shattered bucket. The man was dying on the table, and the master surgeon, the god of the ore, was powerless to stop it. The frustration was a poison in Thorn's veins. He was failing, and he was failing in his own kingdom. It was in this moment of supreme crisis that Anya spoke, her voice quiet but cutting through the noise with the clarity of a bell. "Commander," she said, her eyes fixed on the array of complex diagnostic monitors that track the patient's metabolic state. "Look at his lactate levels and his core temperature drop. It's not arterial. Check the azygous vein system, posterior wall. It could be a full transection." Thorn, his mind locked in a desperate search for a major, obvious source of the bleed, momentarily froze. The azygous vein, a secondary, almost forgotten piece of vascular anatomy that ran along the spine. An injury to it was a 1 in a million rarity, a textbook footnote. The suggestion was so academic, so outside the box of conventional trauma surgery, that he couldn't process it. His frustration, his arrogance, and his fear of failure erupted in a single, explosive moment of condescension. He looked up from the bloody cavity of the soldier's chest and laughed. It was a sharp, ugly, humorless sound. "The azygous vein. Really, nurse?" He sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Are you reading from textbook? I have a man dying from what is clearly a massive hemorrhage, and you're giving me a lecture on obscure anatomy. Thank you for the advice, but I'm a little busy trying to do the impossible here." He had dismissed her. He had ridiculed her. He had, in front of his entire team, declared her irrelevant. At that exact moment, as the surgeon's derisive laughter still hung in the air, the dying master sergeant on the table did something impossible. His eyes, which had been closed and vacant, fluttered open. He was conscious for a fleeting, final moment. He saw Anya standing beside him, and a look of profound, unmistakable recognition crossed his face. He tried to lift his hand, a feeble, desperate gesture. His lips, caked with dried blood, moved, and a single, ragged, whispered phrase escaped, a sound so quiet it was almost lost beneath the frantic beeping of the failing monitors. He was not looking at Anya. He was looking past her, at Commander Thorn. "Sir," he gasped, the word a titanic effort of will. "Listen to her." He took a shuddering breath, his life force fading with every syllable. She trained us." And with that, his eyes rolled back, and his body went limp, the last of his strength expended on that final, cryptic and world-shattering pronouncement. The operating room, which moments before had been a symphony of controlled chaos, fell into a profound, ringing silence. The only sound was the steady, monotone alarm of a monitor signaling cardiac arrest. The soldier's words, "She trained us," echoed in that silence. A piece of information so impossible, so utterly contradictory to the known reality of the room, that no one knew how to process it. Commander Thorne stood frozen, his scalpel poised over the soldier's chest, his arrogant laugh dead on his lips. His mind, a machine of logic and science, struggled to comprehend the statement. Asterisk, "She trained us." Asterisk, this was a master sergeant from the 7th Special Forces Group, one of the most elite, hardened soldiers in the entire U.S. Army. The men who trained these operators were legends themselves, grizzled, battle-scarred command sergeant majors, the absolute apex predators of the military world. He truly looked at the quiet, unassuming Army nurse standing opposite him. He looked at her calm face, her steady hands, her eyes that held no panic, only a fierce, focused intensity. And in that moment, the entire world shifted on its axis. The impossible diagnosis she had offered, the quiet confidence she exuded, the flawless efficiency of her every movement. It all coalesced into a new, terrifying, and awe-inspiring picture. He didn't know how, and he didn't know why, but he knew, with a certainty that was absolute, that the dying soldier had spoken the truth. With dawning, horrified awe, he realized he hadn't just been dismissing a nurse. He had been dismissing his own teacher without even knowing it. The spell of silence was broken by Anya. "He's in PEA," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through Thorne's paralysis. "The heart's lost too much volume. We have less than a minute." "Commander, clamp the descending aorta and find the damn vein." The authority in her voice was absolute, the command of a leader who had been in this exact situation 100 times before. Thorne, shaken to his very core, moved on instinct, his hands responding to her command before his brain had fully processed it. He did as she said, his brilliant surgical skills now guided by her strategic direction. He adjusted his approach, shifting his focus to the posterior of the chest cavity, to the place she had indicated. And there it was, the azygous vein, completely severed, pumping the last of the soldier's life into his chest. It was the 1 in a million injury, the impossible diagnosis. And she had seen it. As he finally clamped the bleeder, Anya was already directing the rest of the team, calling for a massive transfusion, for specific drugs to restart the heart, her voice a calm, steady beacon in the storm. The hierarchy of the operating room had been shattered and reformed. Thorne was still the surgeon, but she was now the commander. They saved him. It was a miracle, a resurrection performed on the edge of a scalpel, guided by a ghost. As the master sergeant's heart was shocked back into a steady rhythm, a new understanding settled over the room. For the rest of the long, bloody night, as the maskell raged on, Thorne and Anya worked as a single, seamless entity. He was the hands, she was the mind. The wall of his arrogance had been completely demolished, replaced by a deep, humbling, and profound respect. He listened to her every suggestion, her every quiet observation, treating them as gospel. And she was never wrong. She diagnosed a fat embolism in a young ranger with a shattered femur based on nothing more than a few subtle petechiae on his skin. She identified a developing cardiac tamponade in a British commando before the pressure drop even registered on the main monitor. She was a living diagnostic engine, her mind a library of every wound, every complication, every possible outcome of a human body subjected to the horrors of war. Later, in a rare moment of quiet between casualties, Thorne, his hands still shaking slightly from the adrenaline and the aftershocks of his revelation, used his high-level security clearance to access her file. The truth he found there was even more staggering than the legend. Major Anya Sharma, Doctor of Medicine, former lead officer for Project Archangel, the Tier 1 Combat Medical Development Program. She had not just been a trainer. She had been the founder and architect of the most advanced and secretive combat medicine curriculum in the world, a program so brutal that only the most elite special operators were even allowed to attend. She had written the very protocols that his own Navy SEAL corpsmen were now using. She was a ghost, a living legend, hiding in plain sight under the guise of a simple liaison nurse. The maskell finally ended as the sun rose, its weak light filtering through the dust-caked windows of the hospital tent. The building was a wreck, the staff were walking zombies, but the dying had stopped. The line had been held. Commander Thorne found Anya in a quiet corner of the ward, meticulously cleaning and sterilizing a tray of surgical instruments, her work seemingly never done. He stood before her for a long moment, the great surgeon, the god of his own kingdom, now a humble subject in the presence of a quiet, unassuming legend. "Major," he said, the word a formal, profound acknowledgement of her true status. "The master sergeant is stable. The doctors at Landstuhl think he'll make a full recovery. He asked me to thank you." He paused, searching for the right words, but there were none. "I was wrong," he finally said, the admission a crack in the armor of his entire identity. "What you did, who you are. It was an honor to be in your operating room." Anya looked up from her work, her eyes holding his. She offered no platitudes, no easy forgiveness. She simply nodded, a single, silent gesture of acknowledgement. The understanding between them was now complete. The surgeon who had laughed at her advice had been taught a lesson he would never forget. He had learned that the greatest strength is often the quietest, and that true masters of their craft have no need to announce it.